her whole relationship to Gerard is not about her loving Gerard, but trying to use Gerard to get the fulfilling relationship that she didn't get out of her husband. When you refuse to do the self-examination, when you refuse to understand who you are, when you persist in fantasy in order to avoid the self-understanding, the self-experimentation, and the work of authenticity, you wrap other people up in your fantasy. You wrap other people up as objects to be used in your fantasy. So we're going to do something a little bit different today. Instead of a regular philosophy video, I'm actually going to be doing a book review of the book Anagrams by Laurie Moore, published in 1986. And this will just be me kind of going over my first impressions with reading the book, and as well as a psychological and philosophical analysis of kind of the story and the characters involved, see where it kind of comes up. And I want to make this a regular thing. I read frequently enough to where I finish books on a regular basis, and it might be interesting to have kind of a running series going over my initial thoughts about these kinds of books that I'm reading, and you guys can follow along with me. Perhaps pick up these books for yourself if they sound interesting to you. I will warn ahead of time that during this review, I'm going to be spoiling this book. So if this is a book on your shelf that you've wanted to read for a while, or you happen to be in the middle of reading Anagrams, then I would stop here and go and read it for yourself. Come up with your own impressions and your ideas. I will be spoiling the major plot points and events that go on in Anagrams. That being said, we can get right into it. I'm actually going to start off by reading the back cover here so that you have a general idea of the story. And the back cover reads, Gerard sits, fully clothed, in his empty bathroom and pines for Benna. Neighbors in the same apartment building, they share a wall, and Gerard listens for the sound of her toilet flushing. Gerard loves Benna, and then Benna loves Gerard. She listens to him play piano, she teaches poetry, and sings in nightclubs. As their relationship ebbs and flows through reality and imagination, Laurie Moore paints a captivating, innovative portrait of men and women in love and not in love. The first novel from a master of contemporary American fiction, Anagrams, as a revolutionary tale of love gained and lost. So, of course, this is a novel, and to be perfectly honest, I don't think this back cover description is accurate. I don't know if this is a story about love as much as the personal psychosis of Benna, but we'll get into more detail in that here in a second. I just wanted to go over kind of my first impressions and reading the book, and kind of just start off with a rating. If I had to rate this out of 5, I would give it a 4, which is, I think, a decent rating because there are some good elements when it comes to this book. The writing is actually really engaging and fun. She is oftentimes using these really clever turns of phrase and wordplay, and she likes to play around with the structure. And not only that, but she tends to be really good at making the scenes visually concrete. And, you know, when you're reading it, you really feel like you're there at the garage sale, or you're in Benna's apartment, or you're in her poetry classroom, or you're in the streets of New York. And what's particularly impressive about it is that much of that is done through dialogue rather than just straight up description, which is, in my eyes, a sign of a masterful kind of writing. And there's also a masterful use of suspenseful illusion, meaning there are all of these scenes and these characters that by the end of the book you learn are not real. They're just sort of made up. And some of these are easier to spot than others, like the character of Georgiana, her imaginary daughter. She quite literally says a couple times that she's imaginary. But even with a character like Georgiana, there are these scenes where it seems as though she's around other people and interacts with them, but there's no direct dialogue. And it's just like this weaving of Benna's illusion throughout her life in a way that is just really interesting to see developed. And you're constantly asking yourself, okay, is she real or is she not? And then some of the other characters like Eleanor, I was actually convinced right up until near the end of the book when it's revealed that she's not real. I was convinced that she was real, in part because she has she seems to have these direct interactions with Gerard in the beginning, and there's no obvious sign, I guess, in my mind that she is fake. And especially at the beginning, she seems so central to kind of the drama that goes on, in the sense that Benna finds out that Eleanor slept with Gerard, but then later on you find out that Eleanor didn't exist in the first place. And it brings up this whole question about Eleanor and who Eleanor is. And it even brings into tension the whole opening scene where Gerard and Benna are living in two different apartments. And I think this scene is placed before she goes to New York, but they're placed in two different apartments. And there's this whole garage sale scene where Gerard, Eleanor, and Benna all seem to be having a garage sale together, and they all seem to be interacting with each other. But then you later learn that Eleanor is not real. And so it makes you question, okay, did the garage sale actually happen? Is Gerard real? If she's made up her daughter and she's made up her best friend, who Eleanor is supposed to be, has she also made up Gerard? And there's that hanging question throughout the whole book, and that gets really solidified at the end. And I just think that is the way that she weaves it to make you continue guessing. The way she weaves it, in which there is no solid answer for 99% of the book, is, I think, an amazing talent. And there's also just pretty good shock value. Gerard dies at the end, and it's very unexpected, and it comes again as a shock to me as a reader. You're thinking that he's going to recover, or you think that he's going to be fine, and that, you know, something beautiful is going to maybe come out of him having this near-death experience, but the author sort of just turns it around immediately, and he dies very quickly, and it's a complete shock, and a bit of catharsis as well. And I thought that was the great use of that. And again, I'm going to say a masterful psychological expression, meaning the way that she portrays Benna's psychological tension and her self-identity being wrapped up in illusion and desperation and the failure to live up or to even have a self-identity. The way that this psychological expression gets peppered and integrated throughout the whole book is wonderful. There's even these scenes where most of the book is from her perspective, but then there are these third person perspectives, and it gives you this sense that she has sort of stepped outside of herself. She is so disconnected from the mask that she is portraying towards people, or so disconnected from wanting to relate to the reality around her, that she sometimes just goes into third person and isn't even connected to herself or recognizes herself in the world. And that peppered out, as well as just the integration throughout the whole story, is quite impressive. The biggest thing though here, and the reason why I'm giving it 4 out of 5 stars, is because it's also a depressing book to read, because there is no ultimate redemption for Benna throughout the book, and there is no resolution throughout the book, which makes it frustrating to read. Benna, at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, is the same person. There is not any progression on her self-delusion, on her illusions, on her lack of self-identity. At the end of the book, when Gerard dies, she sort of just doubles down on her illusions, and she doubles down on her detachment. And so the experience is often Benna repeatedly having the same frustrations over and over again because of her own actions, because of her refusal to face up to her reality, and it is oftentimes her just evading. And you get these moments, Gerard's death is one of them. You get these moments when it seems like she might have some self-clarity. It seems like she might move off in a more authentic or real direction, but she just immediately slips back into her borderline psychosis. And it's wonderful if you are interested to see how that kind of plays out in a person in a concrete way. But it's frustrating if you're expecting or looking for any kind of redemption, any kind of movement away from that, because you simply just never get it. And that can be very frustrating. And she's not the only character who kind of remains flat in this way. Gerard pretty much remains the same. Every single character almost remains the same from beginning to end, whether it's Eleanor, Benna, Gerard, Georgiana, and even Daryl. All of them seem to just remain the exact same and cycle through the same frustrations over and over again. And if it wasn't for the engaging writing, I think you could be forgiven for putting this book down. But she's good at leading you along, so that's all I can say. So that would be like the first impressions about the book overall. I think Laurie Moore is an excellent writer. I think it's hard to judge because you also don't know what the intentions of the author were. Like, was her intention just to kind of write the story of a mentally ill person trying to, just trying to break out and falling and falling and falling again? Or was she trying to write into the book something more idealistic? But again, I think her greatest weakness is that none of her characters really develop, none of her characters really grow. And typically that's what you're looking for in any kind of human story. But this is also published in 1986, so it's got a very postmodern zeal to it. And one of the most iconic themes in most postmodern works is the lack of character progression. But from the analysis of the book as a whole, we can move on to looking at the character of Benna, the main driver of the entire book, right? And from what I can tell and what I remember from the book, and here I'm going off an outline, so this is why I kind of keep looking down here. But from what I can remember and I've written down here, when it comes to Benna, she is in her mid-30s, and I think at the beginning she's like 33, and at the end she's maybe like 35 or so. That's even if you trust the timeline here, and even if you trust that the beginning scene is genuine and not just sort of another fantasy. There's not much there about her childhood, which I think is maybe an intentional decision, not wanting to explain this in terms of the context of her childhood. There might have been stuff there about her father or about her and her father doing things. I just can't remember the exact scenes, and I don't feel like going to look for them. So I'm just going to assume there's not much there about her childhood. We do get information that she was married and that the marriage was really bad from the get-go, that her and her husband kind of just fought, and the marriage seemed like a mistake almost from the beginning. And eventually, I guess there's a question in the air as to whether her husband committed suicide or not. I know he's dead. He did die. I forget the exact reason that she says that he died. But Daryl, her sort of student lover from her classes, repeats a rumor going around that her husband committed suicide. Or at least she plays it off as a rumor, but she's not a very reliable narrator, so it's hard to tell whether or not this is a true revelation, whether she's, when she's thinking about her husband, she's just back projecting a fantasy, right? But I think for the most part, we can say she's a widow. Her marriage was bad, and I think her husband died, and there's a question of whether he committed suicide or not. I think the biggest thing that kind of stands out about Benna is that she's listless and she has absolutely no solid identity. Her careers are unfulfilling. She does aerobics and then she teaches poetry, and both of these are frustrating distractions for her that leave her empty. And She has no friends. Again, you're led to believe throughout the book that she's friends with Eleanor, and even her friendship with Eleanor is in her imagined friend Eleanor is superficial and argumentative, and I guess you could say cliche. And even in her imagination, her imaginary best friend, cheats on her with Jared, or betrays her by sleeping with Gerard. So she has no friends, and her imaginary friend is entirely superficial. Her one real relationship here seems to be with Gerard, but that one also seems largely superficial. She's projecting this ideal image onto him. She wants to have a relationship with him, but can't really get a solid idea of why. He's clearly not interested in any sort of long-term commitment and is interested in other kinds of women, but she still kind of hangs around him because he's the only guy giving her any sort of attention or recognition, besides Daryl. And Daryl happens later on as a kind of reaction against the women that Gerard is sleeping with. So she sleeps with Daryl, who is her student from her poetry class that she teaches. She sleeps with her student, and she's able to do this because of the power dynamic involved there, that she has this authority. And Daryl, too, just seems to be using her and seems not to be actually interested in her. Their relationship very quickly fizzles out, and Daryl finds another woman whom to have sex with. And it seems to be that this isn't the first time this has happened. She's had sex with a different student. She's had other relationships, which again have to do with sex, and maybe she has this desire for a fulfilling relationship, but she's not going after people who would fulfill her, but she's going after people who use her. So she has these superficial relationships, and I think most importantly, especially the sense of listlessness or no solid identity or ambition or even care comes about when there is the cancer diagnostic. Now, again, I don't know whether this cancer diagnostic was real or part of her fantasy, because the whole first section comes into question from what we learn about later. But she gets this diagnosis of cancer, and she's sort of, again, blasé about it, right? Like, she doesn't tell anybody. She doesn't tell her apparent closest person, who is Gerard, that she has cancer. And it doesn't really seem that she cares whether she lives or dies, whether she has cancer or not. Eventually, it gets resolved after she finds out that she's pregnant and she gets an abortion. But there is no, in the moment of her diagnostic, there's no, she almost doesn't seem like she cares, right? Or almost as if it's unreal to her. And this is where more of the psychological understanding comes in, because we see again and again and again that her self-image is entirely wrapped up in fantasy, and the need of fantasy for the sake of fulfillment. It seems as though, from what we can tell, that up to this point, she has lived a life that has been completely unfulfilling. She's chased a career that gives her no understanding. She's dropped out of college, or she had struggles with left the college. She married someone whom she didn't love and got into fights with, and who died. She's been unable to have children, and the one time she does get pregnant, the man who she gets pregnant by is not committed to her, and so she gets an abortion. She doesn't have any close friends, so she invents a friend, but even the invention of her friend is one that is based on drama and cliches. And then she's sort of always taking on these masks. In terms of Gerard, she hides things from him. In terms of Dale, she hides things from him. She pretends to try to be this profound poetry teacher, and uses that sort of false energy to invigorate her classroom, but then ends up being fired at the end anyway, because she's so false and her students can see right through her bullshit. So it seems like throughout this whole thing, she is desperate for what she has lost in her life, right? She wants a fulfilling relationship, and children, and a fulfilling career, and friends. And so instead of facing up to the reality of her past, she's relatively young, just in her mid 30s. Instead of facing up to the reality of her past, her solution is to wrap herself up in these fantasies. Gerard, one of the reasons I don't think this book is about love is I think her whole relationship to Gerard is not about her loving Gerard, but trying to use Gerard to get the fulfilling relationship that she didn't get out of her husband. So she's projecting a fantasy onto Gerard, and Gerard's happy to play along because he gets to have casual sex, and he gets to have, somebody to be a backup when the rest of the things in his life are failing, because he's a failed opera singer, he's a failed musician and pianist. Um, and he has a string of these superficial relationships, but he can kind of always go back to Benna because she's lacks so much of her own self-esteem that she's willing to be used by him. And she's willing to be used by him because she's using him as well. She's using him for this fantasy of relationship. But of course, she doesn't want to get too close to him because that would reveal the fantasy. I mean, this is why they live in different apartments, even though they're together at the beginning of the scene. I think this is part of what that represents. They tend to lead these parallel lives that are largely distant from one another, and then coincide every once in a while in order to perpetuate this fantasy of a real relationship while not wanting to get close enough in order to maintain the fantasy. Because if they got close enough, then Benna would realize, I don't actually want to be with this person, and maybe move on. And I think the same thing with Gerard. So her relationship with Gerard is a fantasy about a fulfilling relationship. She quite literally makes up an imaginary daughter. And this begins after she gets an abortion. So I think that she had a genuine desire to have a child, but she got pregnant by Gerard, who she knows on an instinctual level is a false relationship. And so it's not the desire to have children, it's the desire to have children within a meaningful and committed relationship. She's not able to have that, so she has an abortion. And as a response, she creates this fantasy for herself. She imagines her daughter, Georgiana, who is quite literally again, attempt for escape into fantasy for fulfillment, because her husband's name was George, and I'm sure what she originally wanted was to have a meaningful and fulfilling relationship with her husband and then have a child with him. Gerard is a substitute for him. So Georgiana becomes this wish fulfillment through imagination. And of course, she's like the perfect daughter, right? In so many ways, and completely made up. She's lacking in any of the frustrations, the real frustrations of parenthood, because she's a projected fantasy rather than a reality. She does this with her friend Eleanor. She has absolutely no friends. I mean, this is what you learn at the end. She has absolutely no friends or connections. Even her relationship with her brother is very estranged. And because Gerard is just, she's just using Gerard, and so that's an inauthentic and false relationship. It's almost like she has absolutely nobody in her life, and she kind of comes to this realization at the end. But she made up this imaginary friend, Eleanor, who again just kind of generates this drama for her in her life, and it kind of reveals the way that she looks at relationships in a very superficial way, like as if friendships are just about chatting to each other about drama and causing problems for one another, which is exactly what Eleanor does for her through her own imagination. And I think Daryl as well, her relationship with Daryl is another of these desperate attempts to get an authentic relationship by just using her position of power as a teacher and intersexuality. And again, Daryl's not like he's innocent in this anymore. I think he is like a Vietnam vet, and they're like more similar in age, but so it's not, the power dynamic's not huge, but there's a distinction there. And Daryl is using her as much as he's using Daryl. But again, we're kind of focusing on Benna here. And all of this self-image just wrapped up in fantasy and an escape for the sake of fulfillment is quite literally on the brink of psychosis. There are these scenes that she describes where she will go out into the middle of the street in her pajamas, I think. And it's almost like she's trying to get run over by a car, or she's trying to get people to notice that she's in a crisis by going out and doing something deliberately strange, instead of, directly reaching out to people. And all this desperation for what she's lost, creating this fantasy escape, bringing her out to the edge of madness. This is all kind of a self enslavement, because there are these other scenes where these things fall away. When her relationship fell away, that was a chance for um, self examination. When she recognized the initial inauthenticity of her relationship with Gerard, that was a chance for self examination. When Daryl left her to be with, a more attractive woman, that was a chance for self examination. And I think most striking of all, when Gerard dies, that was a chance for self examination. And it's the closest that she gets to it, because she begins to realize how much of her life is empty without Gerard. Now that the object of her fantasy has died, she has nowhere to place her fantasy. And so instead of attaching herself to an outward fantasy, she now has to turn inward. Of course, her inward world is already corrupted by her imaginary daughter, her imaginary friend. But the crisis of Gerard's death and the shock of Gerard's death, and the fact that people like Maple were there, um, gives her a chance for the first time in the book at the very end to directly self-examine, and she doesn't. And this is one of the most frustrating parts of the book, is the end, that Gerard dies, and her solution is to double down on her fantasy. She doubles down and reinforces. She decides to go to Aruba and doubles down on the fantasy of her relationship with her imaginary daughter Georgiana. And the last bit of the book is almost like this testament to fantasy. It's this testament to illusion. I'll just read this end part here. People around us cough. George leans her head on my arm, mock weary, pre-Raphaelite. She is a gift I have given myself, a legend of pretend. Pretend there's a child dozed between us, wrote Darrow once, and the city's parch and chill is not the world, and the world's not hurtful as a fist holding us sternly, always here and down. It is this nod, in a sense, that her solution here really is more fantasy, more pretending that her world is not falling apart, that she's not alone, that she didn't have an abortion, that her relationship with Gerard and Daryl are not fantasies, that her husband didn't commit suicide, that her marriage wasn't false to begin with, that her career hasn't crumbled and fallen apart. Instead of taking all of that in and processing it and asking, okay, what do I actually want out of life? She doubles down on the fantasy. She doubles down on the pretending. She doubles down on ignoring the problems, which are only going to lead to more fantasies, causing more inauthenticity, getting her further and further away from the truth of herself and the truth of the world around her, which ultimately is going to end up making her more unfulfilled and more frustrated than she's already been. And this is why, for me, the ending was so disappointing and frustrating, because if the ending had been her facing, even just the hint of her facing the truth for the first time, then the book would have felt so much more cathartic. It would have been so much more relief. There would have been so much more hope involved at the ending there. But because it ends in really an advocacy for greater fantasy and greater illusion, you get left with a sense that she's going to just continue on with the same frustrating lack of development that Benna has exhibited throughout the entire book. The same kind of self-enslavement, the same kind of listlessness, the same kind of complete lack of identity and ambition or real self-examination. So, and that's where the book ends. And again, the most I can say is I found a disappointing, entertaining read, but very disappointing ending. So that's really all I've got to say about it. I think, in some ways it's a masterwork of inauthenticity presented through illusion, and the dangers of failing to self-examine, failing to live up to the truth of oneself, of one's history, failing to take seriously one's own values, the dangers of desperately trying to get meaning out of everyone and everything other than who you really are, and taking the risk and the efforts to do the serious self-examination that is required to know what you authentically value, and to take the risks to experiment with what it is you actually value, rather than hopping from one fantasy to the next, trying to avoid yourself, run away from yourself, deny yourself. And it's also the danger that you cause to other people in this, in the sense that, she is not a complete victim in this, right? But she was using her husband, she used Gerard, she used Daryl, she used the very few people around her, she used for her own fantasies. And of course, those people aren't innocent either. They're using her as well. So it takes two to tango. But there's that, when you refuse to do the self-examination, when you refuse to understand who you are, when you persist in fantasy in order to avoid the self-understanding and the self-experimentation and the work of authenticity, you wrap other people up in your fantasy. You wrap other people up as objects to be used in your fantasy, and you help other people to perpetuate their own inauthenticity. And this is exactly what Benna does with absolutely no growth. But that's where I'm going to leave the review. And if you've read this book and you've got thoughts on this, please let me know. I mean, this is just my understanding of it, right? And the wonderful thing about literature in particular is that it is really open-ended in so many ways. You can interpret it in a million different ways, and I would love to see how other people have understood and read this book. There is no, one true representation, and there are perhaps things that I've forgotten about or mistaken in this review or in this book, um, that perhaps you guys have seen, or perhaps you had a more an interesting insight that you'd like to share. I'd love for you guys to share your thoughts on it. The next book I'm reading here it's philosophy. It's going to be Hegel's Reason in History. I actually got through the kind of in the introduction here, and I'm familiar with Hegel, but I've never actually read this work in particular. So that will be the next book that I review on here whenever I finish it. But if you guys like this video, you want to see more, let me know. If there are some books that you think I would enjoy reading, put them down in the comments, and I would be more than happy to check them out. If you like this video, please like it. If you got some value out of this and you think somebody else would, then please share it. And I will talk to you guys next time.